Well, we are well into our series on the Gospel according to Matthew, which is this pretty long letter in the New Testament. And the reason we're diving into this pretty deeply is that we believe the life and ministry of Jesus is central to the history of the world. Literally, central to the history of the world. The events that we're reading about are the defining moments in human history. These are the pivot points for all of human history. And so we are a church that is completely and utterly obsessed with Jesus and his gospel. So what that means is that we really do take seriously the privilege that we have as individuals and as a community to really dig into this good news about Jesus and his kingdom. You might have heard that referred to before as the gospel. The letter we're studying today, and that we've been studying for a while, and we'll continue to study for a while, is the gospel according to Matthew. So I thought it would be good for us to revisit some things about Matthew. Who is this person that's writing? Since the 2nd century, at least, most people have claimed that this Matthew is the one that's listed in the 12 disciples, sometimes called Levi. Most scholars agree that there's not a real legitimate reason to question that. He was employed as a tax collector, basically a Jewish man who worked for Rome collecting taxes on their behalf, income, crops, sales, property taxes. And he's taking these from his own people. And so that gave him an opportunity to exploit his own people and cheat them so that they could make a better life for themselves. The people had no recourse against someone like this because Rome didn't really care as long as they got their money. So for this reason, tax collectors were pretty well despised by a lot of their countrymen because they were helping the people who were oppressing them, right? They were kind of aiding in Roman oppression over them, which even led some religious leaders to claim that they were actually working against God. Not just they were like neutral, but they were actually working against God. Well, one day, Jesus approaches this tax collector, this particular tax collector says, "Follow me," and this particular tax collector does. He gets up from behind his booth, left everything he had, and he followed Jesus. Now, later on, he threw a big party for Jesus, invited a bunch of his tax collector's friends, and, as he put it, other people. So Matthew becomes one of the 12 apostles, and that's awesome because that means that many of the things that he records here are things that he was an eyewitness to. He heard many of these words from the mouth of Jesus with his own ears. He saw many of these things that we're reading about with his own eyes. There's actually a long list of things that we know about the ministry of Jesus only from Matthew's pen. No one else recorded it. This is a man who shared a Passover meal with Jesus. A man who suffered through the anguish of losing not only a friend, but the one he believed to be the Messiah that all of Israel had been waiting for at the crucifixion. A man who was in the room with the disciples when Jesus appeared to them and showed him his nail-pierced hands and feet. A man who spent 40 days with Jesus after the resurrection learning about the kingdom of God. This is a man who watched Jesus ascend into heaven, a man who participated in that vibrant community of believers that we read about in Acts. This is a man who would travel to distant countries in order to proclaim this good news about Jesus and his kingdom. A man who helped that Greek word for witness, martyrs, where it's where we get our word martyr, become synonymous with death. The people who saw and heard these things surrounding Jesus, they became witnesses to it, even when it meant their own death. So this man is all in for the kingdom of God, is what I'm trying to say, and he has a lot to teach us about Jesus. So what we've done is we've divided his letter into 4 sections, and we've completed 2 of those so far. Since we're starting section 3 today, I just wanted to review what those other 2 sections were, and it won't take that long. Section 1 was characterized by the word epicenter. Jesus' entry into the world was like an earthquake that sent out seismic waves in every direction, so something had dramatically shifted under the surface of human history. There would be massive implications for all of humanity. The scope of these events that we're reading about would be universal, yet only a few people on earth even know about them at this point. The effects of his arrival are highly concentrated in this real small place on earth. That's why we chose the word epicenter. because the epicenter of an earthquake is the place on earth which shows the most visible signs of being affected by it. And the epicenter in the first four letters of the New Testament, the four Gospels, is first century Israel. More specifically, in and around a city which has continued to be pivotal in most of human history, Jerusalem. So that's section 1, epicenter. Section 2 was characterized by the word manifesto. Now we know that that word has some political connotations, and that's intentional, because Jesus is in fact inaugurating a new kingdom, which Matthew refers to as the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus' kingdom is often at odds with the prevailing values and priorities of any given culture. So Jesus, throughout this thing called the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, he's laying out his policies and aims. This is what my kingdom is about, talking very directly about the types of lives that he's inviting people to lead who are a part of his kingdom. During that section, we often said that the call to kingdom living is a radical departure from the way we're wired and trained to think and act. Now, Jesus ended that whole section with a fork in the road moment, a choice. You can take the wise road, the wise way, the narrow path, a life built on a solid foundation, or you can take the foolish way, the wide road, and the house built on sand. This way is his way, the wise way, and this way is the foolish way. This way leads to life, this way leads to destruction, which raises the question, who does Jesus think he is? Who does Jesus think he is? And that transitions us pretty nicely into our third section, which we'll start today, characterized by the word authority. There's a Greek word that Matthew just used for the first time at the end of chapter 7 when he said that all of the people looking on were kind of enamored and astounded because Jesus taught as one who had authority. It's the first time he used the word so far, but he's going to use it 9 more times throughout the remainder of Matthew. It's going to be up on the screen there, exousia. In Matthew, this is always translated as authority, and it implies 2 things that are somewhat, they're difficult to separate, honestly, but they're 2 parts of the same coin. I guess you could think of it that way. The first part is weight that is given by someone who has it. That's the first part of it. And the other is power that is embedded in that weight. That's what this word means. A good example of someone in our culture who has this is a police officer. They have weight to carry out justice because it's conferred upon them. There's actually an institution behind them that's backing them. They're not just wearing a uniform and pulling people over and putting handcuffs on people, right? That would be weird, and it wouldn't work, right? There's no weight behind them that way. But they do have weight. They're not just wearing a uniform. There's weight that's been conferred upon them. And the other side of that coin is that they then have power embedded in that weight to enforce the law, right? So that's just a real basic way of thinking about that. There are people, by the way, in every culture who have weight but no power. And then there are people in every culture that have power but no weight. This word is both. In this case, our English word authority does a pretty good job of capturing that. It comes from the Latin word for originator or author, authority. Someone with authority then carries the full weight of the author or the originator of a thing and the capability to use that weight. So someone with authority carries the full weight of the author or originator of that thing and the capability to use that weight. Now, there's another word that's used throughout the New Testament, translated power, and we get our English word for dynamic and dynamite from that word. It's the word dunamis. And that is usually used in reference to miraculous powers or the innate gift to do something special. This type of power, dunamis, was never in question for the people who were watching Jesus' ministry. He had it. The things that we're going to read about over the next 11 chapters demonstrate that there's no doubt in their minds that Jesus had that kind of power. The question they had was whether or not he had authority, or rather, who had given it to him. So over the next 7 weeks, what we're going to do is we're going to explore authority from 7 different angles, 7 different ways that Matthew shows us how Jesus has authority. And that will give us some sense of what exactly he has authority over. And the first aspect of his authority that we're looking at is his authority to heal. To heal. Why are we doing that one first? Because it's the one Matthew goes to right away. So I know when this topic comes up, there'll be some skepticism in the room. That comes from at least 2 places. First place is from a humanistic worldview, right? Of course, humanism rejects anything that's related to theism and also anything supernatural that appears to be supernatural. It's not. There's a way to explain it. So if you're a humanist, you're likely to believe that everything can be explained through human reason, that there is no supernatural thing. So the idea that Jesus has authority to do anything like this is, wow. Let there be light. Doesn't work. So the idea that Jesus has authority to do anything like this is ridiculous to a humanist in its premise and its reporting. Okay, let me tell you what I mean by that. It's ridiculous in its premise because a humanist would say there is no weight that can be given. There's no one that has this type of authority to even confer it. So the whole premise that Jesus might have some authority that is beyond human abilities is false. That's what a humanist would say. And in its reporting, which just means Matthew is lying. Okay? Like this stuff couldn't have happened, or he totally misunderstands what actually happened. So that's a humanistic worldview. If you're here and listening, hey, guess what? You're here and listening, which is good. And I would just invite you to take the journey with us with an open heart and an open mind, if you're coming at it from that perspective. The second place skepticism comes from when you talk about healing is from those who have seen this whole healing thing abused. Okay? I've experienced that along the way, just very personally in my journey, and so I understand that struggle. I know many examples of how belief in healing has been exploited in Christianity, and that's been a difficult thing for me to overcome. I'll just share that real, blatantly. And yet, this is a very central part of the gospel narratives, which is why we could choose from at least a dozen different instances of people that Jesus healed in Matthew alone. Blind men, a woman who had trouble with hemorrhaging for 12 years, a man with a withered hand, a mute man, and the list goes on and on and on. But if we pick up right where we left off last week, we get a pretty full picture. This is starting in chapter 8, verse 1. When Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said, "be clean." Immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, "See that you don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them." I don't know if you know what leprosy is. It's a flesh-eating disease. We're going to show you some pictures, but decided we didn't want to ruin anyone's lunch. I mean, it's just Google it when you go home if you want, after you eat. It's really disturbing what leprosy does to the skin. Now, touching a person with leprosy was the only way, according to the law, that you could become defiled by touching another living human. It can be translated through bodily fluids. It's a bacterial thing, not just by touching someone that has it. But lepers were considered to be unclean. They were forced to live in another part of town. So that meant that they were literally rotting away in the gutters of society. That's what lepers were doing in this part of the world. They were rotting away in the gutters of society. Now, there were instructions in the law, Leviticus 13 and 14, that said what the priests were supposed to do when someone was healed of leprosy. Pretty extensive process, outlining, hey, this day when that happens, when somebody comes and says, "I've been healed of leprosy, here's what to do." Here's the thing, though. That never happened. Never happened to a Jew after the law was given. So it became a rabbinical tradition from the rabbis, that only the Messiah would be able to perform that miracle of healing someone of leprosy. So when Jesus did it and told the man to go show himself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded, That would have been the first time that this had ever happened. This would have been the first time that that section of the law had ever been activated. Now that adds some force, doesn't it, to what Jesus says at the end of it, that this will be a testimony to them. This will show them who I am. It's no accident that Matthew places this miracle immediately after he says the people were enamored by the way he spoke as one who has authority. Matthew continues, another healing story about authority. Verse 5, when Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help. Lord, he said, my servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly. And Jesus said to him, shall I come and heal him? The centurion replied, Lord, I don't deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, he does it. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed and said to those following him, truly I tell you, I've not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then Jesus said to the centurion, go, let it be done just as you believed it would. And his servant was healed at that moment. Centurions were the backbone of the Roman army, which was really powerful. They were generally valiant, courageous warriors who had earned the respect of their superiors through their hard work, good conduct. So their exemplary careers had earned them the privilege now, the opportunity to lead 100 soldiers. There were about 1,700 of them, 1,700 centurions around this time, and they were compensated pretty well for their work. This particular centurion must have been stationed in or around the small fishing village called Capernaum. It's in Galilee, northern Israel. Because when Jesus entered the village, this guy runs up to Jesus, and he asks him for help. The centurion had a servant who's in terrible pain, paralyzed and suffering, and says, will you heal my servant? And Jesus says, yeah, absolutely, I'll heal him. Do you want me to come to your house? And this is where it gets real interesting. The centurion says, you don't need to come. I'm not worthy of that. Just say the word, and my servant will be healed. Because I'm a man who's under authority. I have bosses, right, in the Roman army. And I have authorization to lead the soldiers that I lead. So I know how authority works. And Jesus, you have authority. All you need to do is say the word, and it will be done. Now at this, you can imagine Jesus is really amazed. He says, this is great faith, more faith than anyone in Israel. And that's a pretty bold statement, a pretty offensive statement for all of the people of God in Israel. Jesus speaks the words, let it be done, and it's done. Jesus has the authority to heal someone who's not even in the same room with him with only his word. Now, Matthew undoubtedly wants his reader to wrestle with this, to pause and reflect. How is that possible? How can this be true? What kind of authority, that's the word the centurion uses, what kind of authority must Jesus have to do something like that? I love how the English word authority plays off of the word author, just like the Latin word does. If Jesus is, as some of the first Christians, John and Paul both claim in their writings, the Word who was in the beginning, through whom all things were created, and through whom all things in the universe are held together. He is, in fact, the author, the originator of all created things. John calls him the Logos in the opening paragraph of his gospel. That's a Greek word, much of which has been written about, and there's a lot of significance to that word. Heraclitus is a Greek philosopher that coined that term, and he's the first philosopher to write about this idea. He described the Logos as the ordering principle of the world, the law of nature, the foundation of morality, the unifying underlying source of reason and wisdom. This is where we get our word logic, logos, logic from. This is the independently existing truth that every person has access to, but which few people recognize. This is what we're appealing to when we're in an argument with someone, and this is why we get real frustrated when they can't see our what? Logic. A lot of our spouses are like, no, I get it now. Here's what's fascinating. John is saying that Jesus is this thing. Jesus is the independently existing truth, the ordering principle of the world. He is the one who is the source of all reason and wisdom. He is the rational structure to the cosmos. He is the mind of God come in human form. He was there in the beginning. He was with God in the beginning. He was God in the beginning. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing was made. You can see how Paul reemphasizes this in his letter to the Colossians. He said, Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things in heaven and on earth were created, things invisible and visible, thrones, dominions, rulers, powers, all things have been created through him and for him. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together. You see it? The claim of Christianity is that Jesus is the agent of creation. He is the word spoken in the beginning who brought all things into existence. And so when he speaks, life follows. When he speaks, structure follows. When he speaks, healing follows. This is real authority. This is real authority. And look at how Jesus is choosing to wield it. To bring physical healing to bodies. Now that tells us something about the heart of God, something about the will of God, something that totally aligns with the rest of the story. So in the beginning, when God created his world, there was no pain, there was no sickness, no disease, decay and suffering and death. All those things came into the world as a result of sin. Guess what? Jesus came to overcome the effects of sin, to overthrow death. That's what we just sang about. All hail King Jesus, the Lord of heaven and earth. And by the way, if you can't sing that song passionately, something's wrong with you. I mean, that just, it's such, it's a powerful song. Anyhow, it was not there in the beginning. Jesus came to overthrow it. The reason we know that is because there's no sickness or disease in his second creation either. There's no sickness or disease in his first creation. There's no sickness or disease in his new creation, as described in Revelation. So there's also many times during his ministry that someone runs up to Jesus and says, hey, would you heal me? If you're willing, can you heal me? And never once did Jesus say, no, I'm not in the mood. I'm not willing. I don't want to. Get away from me. Leave me alone. Never does that. God's will is always done perfectly in Jesus. And wherever Jesus goes, there's healing. So, what does that mean for us as we look at this idea of healing? At least three things. First, we shouldn't be shy about praying for healing and having faith that he is willing and able to heal. Jesus was honored and expressed that to people who came up and said, would you heal me? I know that you can. He said things like, your faith has made you whole. He points to their faith. He's honored by that type of faith. And we've had the opportunity to experience this many times where God actually does intervene and he physically heals people. I've seen it. I've seen it happen. But sometimes God hasn't healed too. Seen that happen. What's the problem? Well, we still live in a decaying world. We get glimpses of the kingdom fully come. It's not yet fully arrived. But don't let that discourage us from making bold requests, praying for healing, and believing that he is willing and able to do it. Because God has made the impossible possible in the physical bodies of many people in our community. He just has. Second, it means that our physical bodies are decaying in this world. Sorry if I'm the first person to tell you that. We all know that, right? We all feel that. I'm only turning 35 this month, and I already feel it. Every time I do any type of exercise, I'm like, what? I'm going to die. Too many tombstones and Ben and Jerry's. The fact that Jesus had so many people to heal while he was here is evidence of this, right? That we live in a decaying world. We just do. Paul so delicately worded this: outwardly our bodies are wasting away, but inwardly we're being renewed day by day. Right? The physical life will end in death. It's happened for everybody so far. That's part of it. It's going to happen. But the work of Jesus means that our bodies get healed once and for all in the new creation. The death is overthrown, and there's a new body that gets restored. When heaven and earth ultimately come together, he will restore all things, and that does include our bodies. So when we see physical healing on earth, it's a signpost of the world to come. It's a signpost of the world to come. Here's how we know it's a signpost. Because the people that Jesus healed in his ministry still ended up getting sick and dying later, unless they're still walking around, which I've not heard reports of. But we actually know, right? That's not true. They all went on to die. Even the people that Jesus healed, they went on to die later on. The kingdom has not fully arrived yet, but it will one day, and everything will be made new. Third, and this is a little bit of a stretch, but I think that you can draw this inference from it. Jesus cares about our physical bodies, right? He wants us to live and breathe and walk and dance and thrive, and he does because he crafted these amazing containers that we live in. He's the one that designed them, and they're intricately and meticulously designed. The psalmist says that we were woven together in our mother's womb. We're intricately and meticulously designed on purpose. So we should take care of our bodies. They're crafted by him, and they're given to us as a gift, so we should steward them well. Our bodies are a bunch of systems, which means they're organizations that enable the organism to bring glory to God. We're an organism. We have an organization that allows us to do what we're purposed to do, to live out these lives for glory of God. Sickness and disease are by definition viruses in the system. So we shouldn't be trying to speed those things up or just throwing caution to the wind, because refusing to take care of our bodies because they're going to fail one day is like saying, well, my kids are going to grow up one day, so I'm just done spending time with them, right? It's like somebody gets you a new piece of technology for Christmas, and you're like, well, in 3 years this is going to be outdated, so trash the thing, right? These are gifts. Our bodies are gifts that God has given us, and Jesus seems to be intent on caring for our physical bodies. We have a purpose. God gave us a body to carry out that purpose, and so let's take care of these amazing gifts. Matthew wraps us up, continuing right where we left off, where I just stopped reading. When Jesus entered Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her. And she got up and began to wait on him. When evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with a word and healed all the sick. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities and bore our diseases. Jesus, the King, has authority to heal. That's part one, this whole thing. Next week, we're going to talk about this other thing they said. He drove out spirits. And we're going to talk about the authority that Jesus has in that realm, which should be fun and exciting. All right. Would you pray with me? Father, I ask that these words that we have said today, that they would go out with your Spirit, and that we would live lives that are worthy of your calling, and that we would just embrace this aspect of your authority, and looking at just the big picture, even that you have authority over all things. Your name is powerful. Your name is above all names. Praise in Jesus' name. Amen.